In 1832, a plantation owner in Louisiana dug up a set of enormous fossilized bones and did something that would embarrass paleontologists for the next 2 decades. He assumed he'd found a sea serpent, a real one, and he sold pieces of the skeleton as souvenirs. Table legs were carved from its vertebrae. When the bones finally reached a scientist who knew what he was looking at, he gave the creature a name that's stuck ever since, even though it's completely wrong: Basilosaurus, king lizard. Except it wasn't a lizard at all, it was a whale. And not just any whale, a 60-foot predator with a serpentine body, razor teeth built for slicing rather than filtering, and something tucked near its tail that nobody expects to find on an animal that size: 2 tiny, fully formed back legs, complete with toes. Legs that could never have supported its weight on land. Legs it didn't need for swimming either. So what were they doing there? The answer to that question doesn't just explain one strange fossil, it rewrites what a whale actually is. Let's establish the basics first, because Basilosaurus breaks almost every assumption people carry about whales without even trying. It lived around 40 million years ago, toward the end of the Eocene, in warm, shallow seas that once covered parts of what's now Egypt, Pakistan, and the southeastern United States. It stretched somewhere between 50 and 60 feet long, comparable to a modern sperm whale, but it didn't look like a modern whale at all. Modern whales are built like torpedoes, thick, compact, engineered for sustained cruising through open ocean. Basilosaurus was built like something that shouldn't exist: an impossibly long, narrow, almost eel-like body with a skull shaped for ambush hunting rather than filter feeding or deep diving. If you saw one from a distance, your brain wouldn't file it under whale. It would file it under sea monster. And honestly, that first fossil hunter in Louisiana wasn't entirely wrong to think the same thing. But it's those hind legs that turn Basilosaurus from a strange-looking predator into one of the single most important fossils in the history of evolutionary biology. Here's why. For over a century after Darwin published On the Origin of Species, one of the most common objections to evolution by natural selection was a fairly reasonable-sounding one. Show me the transitional fossils. Show me an animal caught in the act of becoming something else. Critics pointed specifically at whales because the gap seemed impossible to bridge. How does a land mammal, something with 4 legs, walking on solid ground, turn into a fully aquatic animal that spends its entire life in open ocean, gives birth in water, and never once sets foot on land? The physical distance between those 2 body plans looked, to a lot of people, unbridgeable. Basilosaurus is one of the fossils that close that gap. Its legs are the proof, sitting right there in the bone. They're small, around 2 feet long on a 60-foot animal, roughly the proportion of a bath toy strapped to a school bus. But they're not vestigial nubs or evolutionary leftovers reduced to shapeless stubs. They have a fully formed femur, tibia, fibula, even individual toe bones, articulated in a way that shows they were once functional. What they clearly weren't functional for anymore was walking. There's no evidence Basilosaurus could support its own weight on land with them. So researchers had to ask, if they weren't for walking, and they clearly weren't load-bearing, what were they actually doing on a fully marine predator 40 million years into its transition away from land? The leading explanation is one of those details that sounds almost too fitting to be true, and it's not even the strangest part of this story. Paleontologists now think those legs may have functioned as claspers during mating, small anatomical grips that helped males and females align underwater, a leftover structure repurposed for an entirely new job rather than discarded. In other words, evolution didn't erase the legs the moment they stopped being useful for walking. It kept them around and quietly reassigned them, the way an old skill from a previous job sometimes turns out to be useful in a completely different career. That's not a minor footnote. That's a working demonstration of exactly how transitional evolution operates in real time, preserved in bone for 40 million years. And Basilosaurus doesn't stand alone in this story, which is part of what makes it so convincing. It sits in the middle of an entire fossil sequence: Pakicetus, a wolf-sized land mammal with ear bones showing early aquatic adaptations; Ambulocetus, the walking whale, part crocodile, part otter, hunting at the water's edge; Rodhocetus, more streamlined, spending most of its life in water but still capable of moving on land; and then Basilosaurus, fully committed to the ocean, its hind legs reduced to something closer to vestigial hardware than functional limbs. Line those fossils up chronologically, and you're not looking at a gap anymore. You're looking at a documented, step-by-step transformation from a land mammal to an open ocean predator, spanning roughly 10 million years, which, on a geological timescale, is closer to a sprint than a slow drift. Here's where it gets genuinely strange, though, and it's the detail that even seasoned paleontologists bring up first when they talk about this animal. Basilosaurus's brain and inner ear structure show it likely couldn't dive deep or echolocate the way modern whales can. It was probably a surface hunter, patrolling shallow, warm seas, feeding on large fish, and, based on tooth impressions found on the fossilized skulls of a smaller whale relative called Dorudon, quite possibly targeting the young of its own broader whale family. That detail matters because it means Basilosaurus wasn't some peaceful, primitive drifting animal easing its way into ocean life. It was already, 40 million years ago, sitting at the top of the food chain in its ecosystem, an apex predator that happened to still be carrying the skeletal fingerprint of its walking ancestors. So why did those legs eventually disappear completely in modern whales, when Basilosaurus still had them? The honest answer is that they simply stopped being worth the cost. Every structure an animal carries has to be built, maintained, and fed by its metabolism. And once those tiny hind legs weren't doing enough useful work, not for walking, not efficiently enough even for mating in later species, natural selection had no reason to keep investing resources in them generation after generation. Structures that stop earning their keep don't vanish overnight. They shrink, generation by generation, until eventually all that's left in modern whales is a pair of small, floating pelvic bones, disconnected from the spine entirely, doing nothing at all except sitting there as a quiet leftover of a body plan the species walked away from tens of millions of years ago. Basilosaurus is essentially the fossil equivalent of catching that process halfway through. Legs still present, still built, but already well on their way out the door. Which brings the story back to where it started, standing in that Louisiana field in 1832, next to a set of bones that were shaped into household furniture and sold off piece by piece. Nobody in that moment had any idea they were looking at one of the most important pieces of evidence for how life on this planet actually changes shape over time. Not a sea serpent, not a king lizard, a whale mid-transformation, carrying two small legs it no longer needed but hadn't yet lost. Proof that the line between a land animal and an ocean giant isn't a wall at all, it's a slope. And Basilosaurus is the fossil that got caught standing right in the middle of it.